community hall was alive that evening. Laughter bouncing off the old wooden walls, the smell of coffee and homemade pies filling the air. It was a small town gathering, the kind where everyone knew each other's names and stories. Children ran between tables, old friends exchanged gossip, and someone tuned a cheap guitar in the corner. The mood was warm and light, a kind of comfort only small communities understand. Through the crowd, a woman quietly walked in. Clara. She wasn't the type to draw attention. Her dress was plain, faded from years of washing, and her hair was tied back in a simple bun. She clutched her small handbag close to her chest, nodding politely as people passed her. A few greeted her with half smiles, the kind you give to someone you see often but don't really know. Clara had lived in this town for most of her life, but she was rarely the center of anything. She worked at the local bakery, always arriving early and leaving late. Most people thought of her as kind, quiet, and perhaps a little lonely. She didn't speak much about herself, and no one asked. They liked her cinnamon rolls but didn't know her story. The hall was bright and noisy, filled with conversations and the clinking of cups. Clara looked around, searching for a familiar face, but everyone seemed busy talking or laughing. She took a seat near the back, next to a window where the cool evening breeze slipped through a small crack. She watched the scene quietly, the dancing lights, the moving faces, and smiled softly to herself. At the front of the hall stood a large, upright piano. It had once been beautiful, but now it looked tired and worn. The wood was chipped in several places, and the ivory keys were yellowed with age. Some of the strings inside were broken, leaving dark gaps in the soundboard. Someone had pushed it there years ago, hoping to get it repaired, but no one ever did. It had become more of a decoration than an instrument, something people leaned on while chatting. Clara's eyes rested on it for a long moment. To most people it looked like junk, but to her it was something different. She could almost hear the faint memory of music that once came from it, gentle notes that filled the air long ago. She had loved pianos all her life. As a child, she used to sit in front of one for hours, playing whatever songs she could learn by ear. But that was years ago, before life became busy, before work and loss took up most of her days. Someone from the front called out for everyone's attention. It was Tom, a cheerful man with a booming voice who often hosted local events. He joked about the food, told a few funny stories, and kept the room laughing. "We've got everything tonight. Food, friends, and even this old piano that refuses to die," he shouted, tapping the top of the dusty instrument. People laughed. Clara smiled faintly. The sound of laughter around her was nice, but it made her feel even smaller somehow. She looked at her hands, folded neatly in her lap, and thought about how long it had been since she last played music. It felt like another lifetime. She didn't come here for attention. She just wanted to be part of something, to hear laughter, to feel a little less alone for an evening. But as she sat there, she couldn't help glancing again at that broken piano, sitting proudly despite its flaws. Something about it reminded her of herself, old, a little worn out, but still standing. Outside, the sun dipped low, sending soft orange light through the hall's dusty windows. The glow touched Clara's face gently, highlighting the quiet strength in her eyes. Around her, people continued to talk and laugh, unaware that in a few short moments, this same quiet woman would change the mood of the entire room. The music that would later fill the hall was still waiting inside her, buried beneath years of silence, pain, and memories. But for now, she simply sat there, still and thoughtful, like a story not yet told. As the chatter grew louder, someone dropped a glass. The sharp sound snapped through the noise, followed by another round of laughter. Clara smiled politely when someone offered her a drink, but she refused. She wasn't there to drink or dance. She was just there to listen, to observe. And yet deep inside, something small was stirring. Maybe it was the sight of the piano, maybe the loneliness in her heart, or maybe just the music she had kept locked away for so long. Whatever it was, it made her fingers twitch slightly, as if they remembered a melody they hadn't played in years. No one noticed her quiet presence. To them, she was just another face in the crowd, a simple woman with kind eyes and soft manners. But sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest stories. That evening, Clara didn't know that fate had chosen her for a moment she would never forget. The laughter, the chatter, the jokes, all of it would soon fade away, replaced by something far more powerful. For now, though, she remained in her seat watching, listening, waiting, unaware that within that same hall her life was about to change, and an old broken piano would soon become the voice that told her story. The evening grew warmer as more people filled the hall. The air was thick with laughter, the sound of chairs scraping and the smell of baked bread. Someone had started playing music from their phone through a small speaker, and a few couples danced near the center. Clara watched them smiling quietly. She liked watching other people happy. It made her heart feel calm. Tom, the same man who had been telling jokes earlier, was now moving around the room with a drink in his hand. He liked to entertain. It was his favorite thing. "All right, everyone," he called out. "We've sung, we've danced, we've eaten. What else can we do to make tonight fun?" People shouted random suggestions. Tell another story. Play a game. Make someone sing. The room filled with playful noise. That's when Tom's eyes fell on the old piano in the corner. It looked out of place. Dusty, forgotten, but standing proud as if it still had something to give. Tom grinned mischievously. "Hey, how about some live music?" he said loudly, tapping the piano with his knuckles. The dull sound made a few people laugh. "Well, maybe not from this thing," he added, pretending to shiver at the out-of-tune keys. Everyone chuckled, except Clara. She looked at the piano again, her heart pulling toward it like a magnet. Then someone from the crowd, a woman named Marla, known for her loud laughter, shouted, "Clara used to play piano, didn't you?" The words hung in the air. Heads turned toward Clara. She froze, blinking in surprise. Tom laughed, waving his hand. "Oh, really? Well then, Clara, maybe you can wake this old thing up for us." His voice was teasing, but not cruel. Just playful, like a man trying to make everyone laugh. The crowd joined in, clapping and chanting lightly. "Yes, Clara. Go on, play something." Clara felt her cheeks warm. She hadn't played in years, not in front of people, not since her husband's passing. She looked down at her hands resting on her lap. They trembled slightly. The idea of playing again made her heart beat faster, half with fear, half with something she couldn't name. "Oh no," she said softly, smiling shyly. "I haven't played in a very long time." Tom chuckled. "All the more reason to start again. Come on, it'll be fun. We promise not to judge the piano if it sounds bad." The room filled with light laughter again, but the laughter wasn't cruel. It was friendly, a joke shared between neighbors. Still, Clara could feel a small sting inside. They didn't mean harm, but something about being treated like a quiet amusement hurt a little. She looked again at the piano, that poor broken thing that everyone made fun of. Something changed in her expression. The corners of her mouth curved into a soft, determined smile. "All right," she said suddenly. The laughter stopped for a moment. "I'll play." A small hush fell over the room. Tom blinked, surprised. "Wait, really?" Clara nodded gently, standing up. She smoothed her dress with her hands and walked toward the piano. Every step seemed to echo softly against the wooden floor. The crowd began to murmur quietly, curiosity replacing laughter. When she reached the piano, she ran her hand across its top, feeling the dust and rough scratches. It felt cold, like something forgotten. She lifted the cover and looked down at the keys. Some chipped, some discolored, a few stuck in place. Tom came up beside her, still smiling, but now a little unsure. "You sure, Clara? I think half the keys don't even work." Clara looked at him with a small, warm smile. "That's okay," she said. "I only need a few that do." A quiet chuckle rippled through the room. Then she pulled the bench closer and sat down. Her back straightened, and for a moment she looked much younger, as if time had rolled back. The crowd leaned in, expecting a few funny notes, maybe a short tune and another round of laughter. But Clara wasn't thinking about them anymore. She placed her fingers gently on the keys. The cool touch of ivory against her skin brought back memories. Her first piano lesson, her wedding day song, long nights spent playing alone after her husband passed. She pressed one key. The sound was slightly off but clear. She pressed another, then another, testing them like old friends. Then she took a slow, deep breath. The hall fell silent. Even the children stopped whispering. And then, music. Soft at first, uncertain, like the piano was waking from sleep. But then her hands began to move with purpose. The broken instrument groaned and hummed, Yet the melody that came out was pure, warm, and strangely beautiful. People stared. The sound filled the room, not perfect, but alive. Notes shimmered and danced through the air, wrapping around the crowd. The laughter was gone, replaced by stillness, awe, and something deeper. Clara was lost in it. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her eyes half closed. Every movement was full of emotion. Quiet strength, sorrow, love, and peace all at once. The piano may have been broken, but her heart knew how to make it sing. Tom stood frozen, his usual grin gone, replaced by a stunned expression. Marla covered her mouth, eyes wide. The entire hall was under a spell, and at that moment no one remembered it had started as a joke. The room had grown strangely quiet. Only the sound of Clara adjusting the old wooden piano bench filled the air. Every pair of eyes followed her, some curious, some amused, and some quietly skeptical. Nobody really expected much. To them, this was still part of the evening's fun. A little harmless joke. Clara's fingers hovered above the dusty keys, her breath steady but her heart racing. The piano was in terrible shape. Half the keys were chipped and a few wouldn't even move when pressed. The smell of old varnish and dust floated up as she leaned closer. Still, she smiled softly. It reminded her of an old friend who had seen better days but was still waiting to be remembered. She pressed one key gently. A dull, uneven note echoed. A few people laughed quietly at the sound. Tom made a light-hearted joke about calling a piano doctor. Clara didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the keys. Then she pressed another note. This time it rang clearer, though slightly off tune. She began pressing random keys one by one, listening carefully, almost like she was having a private conversation with the instrument. The laughter faded. People watched, confused but intrigued. Finally, she placed both hands on the keyboard and closed her eyes. For a moment, everything around her, the lights, the people, the whispers, disappeared. She was no longer in that noisy hall. In her mind, she was back in her childhood home, sitting beside her mother's piano. She remembered how her mother's gentle voice used to say, "Don't just play notes, Clara, tell a story." And then she began to play. The first few notes were soft, almost like a whisper. The sound was fragile but full of feeling. Her fingers moved slowly at first, exploring the broken keys, finding the ones that still sang. Then little by little, the music grew stronger. The melody she played wasn't from any sheet. It was something deep inside her, something she had carried for years but never shared. It started as a simple tune, tender and emotional, but soon her hands danced across the keyboard with grace that seemed impossible on such an old piano. The crowd went still. Even the children who had been restless earlier were frozen, eyes wide. There was something hauntingly beautiful about what they were hearing. The broken notes somehow made it more real, more human, like the piano itself was crying and healing at the same time. Clara's eyes stayed closed. Her face softened as she played. Every movement of her fingers seemed to carry a memory, love, loss, and quiet strength. The light from the windows touched her hair, making it shine like gold. For a moment, she didn't look like a simple woman from a small town. She looked like someone who had lived 1,000 lives through music. Tom stood near the side, completely speechless. He had started this whole thing as a joke, but now he felt a lump in his throat. He glanced at Marla, who was blinking rapidly, trying to hold back tears. The music swelled and filled every corner of the room. Some of the keys stuck, creating soft pauses, but Clara used them beautifully, turning flaws into emotion. Each missed note felt like part of the story, a reminder that even broken things can create beauty. As the melody reached its middle, her hands moved faster, more confident. The crowd leaned in unconsciously, as if afraid to miss a single note. The energy in the hall changed. Laughter had turned into awe. The room was no longer full of noise and jokes. It was full of silence and feeling. Clara remembered her late husband for a brief moment. He used to sit beside her when she played, eyes closed, smiling. He always said her music made the world softer. For years after his death, she couldn't touch a piano. The sound hurt too much. But tonight, something was different. She felt free. Her hands slowed as she reached the final part of the piece. The melody softened again, drifting like a sigh. The last few notes trembled. One of the strings inside the piano snapped quietly, but even that sound seemed to belong. It was as if the piano was giving its all, one last time. When the final note faded, the room stayed silent. For a long, breathtaking moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint creak of the piano settling. Clara kept her eyes closed, her fingers resting gently on the keys. Then she opened her eyes and looked up. What she saw made her heart tighten. People were staring at her with wide, shining eyes. A few had tears streaming down their cheeks. Marla was covering her mouth again, but this time she wasn't laughing. Tom's usual grin was gone. Instead, he looked moved, humbled, and then the applause began. It started slow, one pair of hands clapping softly. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the hall filled with the sound of clapping, cheers, and whistles. People stood smiling, crying, shouting her name. Clara smiled, a small, peaceful smile, and bowed her head slightly. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years. In that moment, no one saw her as the simple woman anymore. They saw her as something else, a soul who could turn brokenness into beauty, who could take an old forgotten piano and make it sing again. The laughter that had started the moment was gone. What replaced it was something unforgettable. Respect, admiration, and a quiet sense of wonder that would stay with them long after the music ended. For a long moment, the sound of clapping echoed through the small hall like a soft storm, but even after the applause faded, something still hung in the air, something that couldn't be seen but could be deeply felt. The atmosphere had changed. The same people who had laughed moments earlier now looked different. Faces that were once filled with amusement were now full of awe, tenderness, and quiet shame. It was as if they had all witnessed something sacred, something that had touched a part of their hearts they didn't even know was waiting. Clara sat still for a moment longer. Her hands rested gently on her lap and her head was slightly bowed. She wasn't smiling widely or expecting praise. She just breathed slowly, almost as if she was trying to let go of all the emotion that had risen inside her. Tom was the first to speak, his usual loud voice suddenly soft. "Clara," he said, his words trembling a little. I don't even know what to say." Clara looked up and smiled gently. "You don't have to," she said. It was just music, but it wasn't just music. Everyone in that room knew that. It had been more than a melody. It had been a confession, a story, a mirror. Through her playing, she had shown them something they hadn't expected to see. Beauty inside brokenness. Someone from the crowd, an older woman named Mrs. Hart, wiped her tears and whispered, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Clara blushed lightly and looked down. Compliments always made her shy. She wasn't used to attention. Her life was quiet. Simple days at the bakery, quiet evenings at home with tea and old photographs. She never thought of herself as special. But tonight the music had made her visible in a way that words never could. Tom took a deep breath and stepped closer to the piano. He touched the top of it and looked at her. "How did you do that?" "Half the keys don't even work," he said with a shaky laugh. Clara smiled faintly and shrugged. "You just have to listen to what still works instead of worrying about what's broken." Her words hung in the air like poetry. A few people exchanged glances. They knew she wasn't just talking about the piano anymore. The piano itself seemed different too. It no longer looked like an old piece of junk. The dust on its wood now shimmered faintly in the warm light, and the strings inside, some broken, some still holding, looked almost noble, like scars of survival. It had been mocked earlier, but now, after Clara's hands had touched it, the piano felt like a living thing. A few people stepped forward to look closer. "I can't believe this sound came from this old thing," someone whispered. Clara smiled quietly, running her fingers once more along the keys. "Every instrument has its soul," she said softly. "You just have to be kind enough to listen." There was a gentle pause. The sound of her words, simple as they were, seemed to echo inside each person's heart. Marla, the woman who had teased Clara earlier, walked up slowly. Her eyes were still wet. "Clara," she said in a shaky voice, "I'm sorry if we made fun. We didn't mean to, we just thought—" She trailed off, embarrassed. Clara shook her head kindly. "It's all right," she said with a small smile. "Sometimes laughter is just another way of not knowing what beauty looks like yet." Marla let out a small laugh, half crying, half smiling. The two women shared a quiet look that said more than words ever could. Forgiveness, respect, and understanding. The crowd started to talk again, but the tone was different now. Softer, kinder. There was no teasing, no joking, just warmth. People began sharing small stories of their own, about their old hobbies, their forgotten talents, things they used to love but stopped doing. Clara's performance had awakened something in them, something they didn't even realize they'd lost, the desire to feel alive again. Outside, the night had deepened. The windows glowed faintly from the golden light inside. A light breeze moved the curtains, and somewhere far away a train whistle sounded, long and lonely yet peaceful. Tom stood near the door. For a moment, watching everyone, he saw old friends talking in softer voices, strangers sharing smiles. He realized that Clara hadn't just played a piano. She had changed the energy of the entire room. He turned back to her. "You know," he said, "I've hosted a lot of nights here, music, games, even talent shows, but I don't think I've ever seen a moment like this." Clara laughed gently. "I think it was the piano's turn to speak." Tom chuckled and nodded. Maybe so. Maybe it was waiting for someone who'd listen. People began coming up to Clara, thanking her, shaking her hand, asking if she'd teach them or play again next week. She smiled at each one but kept her answers humble. She didn't promise anything. She just said she was glad they enjoyed it. When most of the crowd began leaving, a few people stayed behind, still talking softly. The piano remained where it was, silent again but somehow glowing with quiet dignity. Before leaving, Clara touched it once more, almost like saying goodbye. She whispered under her breath, "Thank you," though no one heard her. As she walked toward the door, Tom called after her. "Clara, will you come back next week? Maybe play again?" She turned, smiling in that calm, mysterious way she always did. "We'll see," she said. "Maybe if the piano still remembers me." And then she stepped out into the cool night air. The stars were bright above the town, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt something deep and warm inside her chest, a spark she thought she had lost forever. Inside the hall, people were still talking about her, about the music, about the way it had made them feel. But Clara didn't need to hear any of it. She already knew. She had come as a simple woman, quiet and unnoticed, but she was leaving as something else, someone who had reminded, an entire room that even broken things could create beauty again. The sound of Clara's music still lived in the air long after she stopped playing. It was as if the walls themselves had memorized the melody and didn't want to let it go. People stood quietly, unsure whether to speak or just stay in that silence a little longer. No one had expected this, not from the old piano, not from the quiet woman they barely noticed when she walked in. It was the kind of silence that happens only after something truly beautiful, the kind that doesn't need words. Clara sat for a moment longer, her hands still resting lightly on the keys. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from the rush of emotion that still moved through her. The hall felt different now, softer, warmer. The crowd that once laughed now stood frozen in awe, faces lit by a quiet glow. In the front row, a little boy sat on his mother's lap, eyes wide and shiny. He whispered, "Mommy, the piano sounds like it's crying." His mother didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, and her own eyes glistened with tears. Near the back, Marla pressed a tissue to her face. She had started the teasing earlier, but now she was the one wiping tears. The sound of Clara's playing had reached deep into her. It had reminded her of her own mother, who used to hum lullabies when she was small. She felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude she hadn't felt in years. Tom, who usually filled every silence with jokes, stood still with his hands in his pockets. His eyes were glassy too, but he tried to hide it. He looked around the room, watching the way everyone's faces had softened. Even the men who normally kept straight expressions were blinking fast, pretending they weren't emotional. Clara slowly turned on the piano bench and looked at them. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said enough. It was a look of kindness, not pride, not surprise, just quiet understanding. Finally, a sound broke the silence, a single clap. Then another. Soon the whole hall filled again with applause, louder this time but still respectful, not wild or noisy, just full of love and admiration. People began to rise to their feet. Some cheered softly, others whistled. A few simply stood there with their hands pressed together, as if they were witnessing something holy. Clara smiled shyly, her cheeks pink. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the sound of clapping. Do another one, someone shouted. Please, one more. Clara laughed quietly. Maybe next time, she said, standing up slowly. Her knees ached a little, but she felt lighter than air. Tom stepped forward, still shaking his head in disbelief. I swear, Clara, he said. If anyone had told me that piano could sound like that, I'd have called them crazy. Clara brushed a little dust off her skirt and smiled. Sometimes things just need the right touch, she said. There was a pause. Everyone knew there was a deeper meaning behind her words. They all felt it, that she wasn't just talking about the piano. Mrs. Hart, the elderly woman who had been crying earlier, walked over slowly. She reached out and took Clara's hand. My dear, she said, voice trembling, that music. It reminded me of my wedding day. The song they played when I walked down the aisle. I hadn't thought of it in years. Clara squeezed her hand gently. Music does that, she said. It brings back things we forgot we needed to remember. More people came to her, thanking her, telling her how her music made them feel. Some shared their own memories. Others just smiled through their tears. Every word touched Clara's heart deeply. She had never expected any of this. Outside the windows, the night was deep blue. Streetlights flickered softly and the stars looked unusually bright, like they too had paused to listen. As the room slowly filled again with quiet conversation, Clara sat back down for a moment, alone with the piano. She touched the keys lightly, not to play, just to feel them. They were rough and uneven under her fingertips, but they felt alive. She whispered to herself, You did good tonight, old friend. No one heard her. But if someone had been close enough, they might have noticed how gently she said it, as if the piano were a living soul who had helped her speak what her heart couldn't say. Tom watched her from a distance, his expression soft. He felt a strange sense of guilt for making her the center of a joke earlier. But that guilt quickly turned into admiration. He realized he had just witnessed something rare, a moment that would stay with everyone who saw it. When Clara finally stood and stepped away from the piano, people made room for her, nodding respectfully as she passed. Some touched her arm as she walked by, a quiet gesture of thanks. At the door, she turned back once more. The piano stood in the corner, silent again, but no longer looked broken. It looked proud, like it had finally been seen for what it truly was. The hall was still full of people, but their energy had changed. There was no more noise, no gossip, no small talk, just a calm feeling that wrapped around them all, the kind of peace that only beauty can leave behind. Outside, as Clara stepped into the cool night air, she breathed deeply. The breeze touched her face, and for the first time in many years, she felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. Her heart was light, her mind quiet. Behind her, through the door left slightly open, faint laughter began again. Not the careless kind from before, but the soft, grateful laughter of people who had been moved. The broken piano had fallen silent once more, but in every heart that heard it that night, its song was still playing, quietly, endlessly, beautifully. The applause slowly faded, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of emotion, full of the kind of quiet that happens only after something beautiful and true. People were still breathing in the memory of Clara's music, holding on to it like a fragile dream they didn't want to end. Clara stood beside the piano, her fingers still brushing the wooden edge as though she was afraid to let go. The old instrument sat there, silent now, but somehow it looked alive, almost glowing in the dim light. Dust sparkled faintly in the air, catching the golden shine from the lamps. Tom finally spoke, his voice soft but filled with awe. Clara, I don't even know how to describe it. Clara smiled quietly. You don't have to, she said. Some things are better felt than explained. Her words lingered like music. The crowd began to stir again, speaking in soft tones. People who had never talked to Clara before came closer, smiling, nodding, some even reaching out to hold her hand. Where did you learn to play like that? Someone asked. Clara hesitated for a moment, her eyes lowering to the piano keys. A long time ago, she said gently. My mother taught me, and later my husband. The crowd grew quiet again, sensing something deep in her voice. He loved to listen, she continued softly. After he passed away, I stopped playing for a while. It just hurt too much. But tonight I thought maybe I could try again. Tom's face softened. He'd be proud of you, he said quietly. Clara looked up, her eyes warm and full of gentle light. Maybe, she whispered. But I think he was here tonight. I could feel him listening. The room felt smaller then, more intimate, as if everyone had suddenly become one big family. Strangers who had laughed together earlier now stood side by side in silence, united by the same invisible emotion. The piano, once considered a useless piece of furniture, had become the center of the night. Someone reached out and touched one of its keys almost reverently. It made a faint, tired sound, and everyone smiled. A man from the back said, "That old piano hasn't sounded that beautiful in years. Maybe we should finally fix it." Years. Maybe we should finally fix it. Laughter rippled softly through the room, not mocking this time but tender. "Yes," another woman added, "we should. It deserves it now." Tom nodded, his usual joking tone replaced by quiet determination. "We'll fix it," he said. "And Clara, when it's ready, you'll be the first to play." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I don't know." But the crowd interrupted with cheers and applause. "Yes, she has to play again. Next time we'll have candles and make it a concert." Clara laughed, a small real laugh that reached her eyes. "You'll make me blush," she said, her cheeks pink. As the laughter filled the room, a new warmth settled in. The people who once saw her as just another quiet face now looked at her differently. They saw strength, grace, and beauty in her simplicity. They saw a woman who had turned an old broken piano into a bridge between hearts. After a while, the crowd began to leave. People patted Clara on the shoulder, thanked her again, and told her she had made the night unforgettable. The sound of footsteps and soft chatter faded until only a few people were left. Tom stayed behind to help clean up. Clara stood near the piano, her fingers touching the keys one last time. The hall was quiet now, lit only by the last few lights. She pressed a single key, one that had stuck before, and it made a soft, uneven sound. She smiled. "Still trying, aren't you?" she whispered to the piano. Then she played one last note, a gentle low tone that trembled for a moment before fading into silence. It was imperfect, but it was beautiful. It was a goodbye, a thank you, and a promise all at once. Tom, standing by the door, heard it and smiled. "One last note?" he asked. Clara nodded, just to remind it that it still loved. They both laughed quietly. As Clara walked out into the cool night, the air felt fresh and full of possibility. The stars twinkled softly above, and the moonlight fell across her path like silver threads. She felt something peaceful inside, not excitement, not pride, just a deep sense of calm. For years she had carried silence inside her, a silence heavy with grief. But tonight she had turned that silence into sound, and in doing so, she had freed herself. She looked back once more at the hall, where faint light still shone through the windows. Inside, the piano stood alone but not lonely. It had finally been heard. Clara whispered into the night, "Thank you for letting me remember." Then she walked home slowly, her steps light, her heart open, her soul quietly singing the same melody she had just played. And though the piano no longer made a sound, its final note still lived on, not in the air, but in the hearts of everyone who had listened. It was the kind of music that never really ends, only changes form. From sound to memory, to something eternal. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, a gentle breeze passed through the empty hall, brushing against the piano keys. One of them moved slightly, making a faint sound, like an echo of Clara's touch. It was as if the piano itself was saying, "Thank you." And in that small, magical moment, the hall, the piano, and the quiet woman who played it all shared the same beautiful truth, that even the most broken things can create music. And even the softest hearts can leave echoes that never fade. The next morning, sunlight poured through the bakery windows, painting golden lines across the floor. The air smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon, Clara's favorite scent. She moved quietly between the counters, her hands working with the steady rhythm of habit, kneading dough, brushing pastries, wiping flour from her apron. Her body was at work, but her mind was still in the community hall. Every note she had played echoed faintly in her heart. It felt unreal, how something that began as a joke had turned into such a beautiful night. She smiled softly to herself as she remembered the look on everyone's faces. The awe, the warmth, the way their laughter had turned into silence. It wasn't pride she felt. It was something gentler, like gratitude. She hadn't just played music. She had shared a piece of herself that had been hidden for far too long. The bell above the bakery door jingled. Tom stepped in, his usual grin wide and friendly. "Morning, Clara," he said, brushing the cold from his jacket. "Good morning," she replied, smiling. "You're up early for once," he chuckled. "Couldn't sleep. My head's still full of music." He paused, then added more softly, "You really left us speechless last night." Clara laughed lightly. "That's not easy to do," Tom nodded. "You're right. I talked too much," they both smiled. For a moment, there was a comfortable silence between them, broken only by the soft hum of the oven. Tom leaned against the counter. "You know, everyone's still talking about you. The way you played, the way that old piano sounded. We're planning to fix it up, by the way. Maybe even repaint the hall. You inspired something, Clara." She looked surprised. "Me? I didn't do anything special." Tom shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. You reminded us of something we'd forgotten. How music can change a room. How it can change people." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked down, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't mean to change anything," she said softly. "I just played because I needed to." Tom tilted his head. "Needed to?" Clara hesitated, then sighed gently. She looked out the window, watching the sunlight flicker on the glass. "You know," she began, "when my husband was alive, he used to sit by me whenever I played. He wasn't much of a talker, but whenever I played, he'd close his eyes and say, 'Now the house feels alive.'" Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. "When he passed away, the house went quiet. I couldn't touch the piano anymore. Every time I looked at it, it reminded me of what I'd lost. So I covered it with a sheet and stopped playing." Tom's face softened, the smile fading into sympathy. "For years," Clara said, "I thought that silence was my way of keeping him close. Like if I didn't play, I wouldn't have to face how empty the house felt." She paused, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "But last night, when I saw that broken piano, I saw something familiar in it. It looked like me, old, cracked, forgotten. I think that's why I wanted to play." She smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes but not falling. "When I started, I was scared. I thought it would sound ugly, that everyone would laugh again. But the moment I touched the keys, it was like he was there, like the music brought him back just for a little while." Tom swallowed hard, his voice quiet. "Clara, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "It's funny, isn't it? I was so afraid of breaking down, but instead I think I broke something open. In everyone." He nodded slowly. "You did. You didn't just fix that piano, Clara, you fixed something in us too." She looked up at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Tom smiled sadly. "You know, we all came there last night to laugh, to escape. But when you played, you reminded us that real beauty isn't perfect. It's brave. It's honest. You gave us that." Clara stood there quietly for a moment, her hands resting on the counter, her eyes soft and thoughtful. "Maybe that's what music is for," she said finally. "Not to impress people, but to remind them they can still feel something." Tom nodded, unable to find words. The bakery bell jingled again, and Mrs. Hart walked in, holding a small bouquet of daisies. She smiled warmly. "Clara, dear," she said, "these are for you. I haven't stopped thinking about your music all night." Clara took the flowers gently, her heart swelling. "Oh, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," Mrs. Hart said firmly. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, the feeling of being alive." Tears finally escaped Clara's eyes then, not of sadness, but of quiet joy. She hugged the old woman, the scent of flower and daisies mixing in the air. When Mrs. Hart left, Tom smiled. "Looks like you've got fans now." Clara laughed through her tears. "I don't want fans," she said. "I just want people to remember that even broken things can still make music." Tom nodded slowly. "You did more than that, Clara. You made us believe it." She smiled, in that same calm, glowing smile she had the night before. And as Tom left the bakery, the bell jingling behind him, Clara looked around her little shop, the flour, the bread, the sunlight, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Her husband's words echoed gently in her heart. "Now the house feels alive," she whispered back. "Yes, it does." And though the piano was miles away in that quiet hall, she knew its music was still playing, not in sound but in spirit, carried by every heart it had touched. Weeks passed since that unforgettable night at the community hall, but people were still talking about it as if it had happened yesterday. In the bakery, in the small grocery store, even at the schoolyard, the story of the simple woman who made a broken piano sing had become part of the town's heart. Clara, however, didn't think of herself as anyone special. She went back to her quiet routines, waking early, baking bread, smiling at customers. But something in her had changed. Her steps were lighter. Her laughter came easier. She no longer looked down when she walked through the town square. People greeted her warmly now, not just with politeness but with genuine respect. Every day, someone would stop by to tell her how much her music had meant to them. "Clara," Mrs. Hart would say while picking up her bread, "your song made me call my sister again after years. We had stopped speaking, but that night reminded me how short life is. We had stopped speaking, but that night reminded me how short life is." Another young man once came into the bakery, a shy look on his face. I started painting again," he said quietly. "I'd given it up a long time ago, but watching you play that broken piano made me think, maybe I could still make something beautiful, even if I'm not perfect." Each story touched Clara's heart. She realized that what had happened that night wasn't just about her. It had awakened something in everyone. The music had rippled outward like waves in still water, touching hearts she didn't even know she'd reached. A few weeks later, Tom visited the bakery again, this time holding a small envelope. "It's ready," he said, grinning. Clara raised an eyebrow. "What's ready?" "The piano," he said proudly. "We fixed it." Her eyes widened. "You did?" Tom nodded. "We got a few people together, and Mr. Green, who used to work in a music shop, helped tune it. The carpenters repaired the wood, and the kids from the art class painted it. You should come see it." That evening, Clara walked back to the hall. The sun was setting, and the sky was a soft pink, the same color as the piano's new coat of paint. When she stepped inside, her breath caught. The piano stood gleaming near the stage, polished and whole again. The cracks had been filled, the broken keys replaced, and the entire instrument seemed to glow in the golden light. She walked closer, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the smooth wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Tom smiled beside her. "It's yours now," he said. Clara turned to him, startled. "Mine? Oh no, Tom, I can't." He shook his head firmly. "You can and you must. You gave it life again. It belongs to you." Her eyes shimmered with tears. She tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, she sat down on the bench and pressed one key. The note rang pure and strong, like the sound of healing. People had gathered quietly around her. Some had heard she was coming and wanted to see her play again. They didn't cheer or clap this time. They just stood, smiling, waiting. Clara smiled back, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody was gentle, different from before, lighter, full of hope. It was the sound of peace, of moving on, of remembering love without pain. The piano responded beautifully, every note clear and warm. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces glowing in the soft light. Older folks held hands. Couples leaned into each other. And through it all, Clara played. No fear, no sadness, just pure joy. When she finished, there was no loud applause this time. Just quiet smiles and shining eyes. Mrs. Hart stepped forward and said softly, "You've given this town something it didn't know it needed, dear. You reminded us how to feel." Clara stood, her heart full. "No," she said gently. "You all reminded me. I just played." After that day, the piano was never left untouched again. Every weekend, people came to the hall to play. Some skilled, some beginners, some just curious. Clara would often sit nearby, listening, smiling, sometimes helping a child find the right key. She became the quiet guardian of that piano, and in a way of the community's spirit. The laughter that once filled the hall returned, but it was different now. Softer, kinder. The hall became a place of music and stories of people coming together, and in the center of it all stood that once broken piano, now whole, shining and alive. Years later, when people spoke of that night, they didn't talk about the old jokes or the laughter before it happened. They talked about the moment the music began, the moment when a quiet woman taught everyone that even the most ordinary soul can hold extraordinary beauty. And somewhere, in the stillness of every evening when the wind moved gently through the town, people swore they could still hear the faint echo of Clara's music, soft, emotional and full of life. A simple woman, a broken piano, and a story that would never be forgotten.